In 664, a king stood in a cold monastery on the Yorkshire coast and made one decision that changed British Christianity forever. That king was Oswiu of Northumbria, and the meeting that forced his hand was called the Synod of Whitby. At that gathering, he was asked to settle what seemed like a technical dispute about the date of Easter. But what was really at stake was something far bigger. Who would control English Christianity, and whether Britain would look west to Ireland or south to Rome? To understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand how Christianity in Britain had fractured in the first place. When the Roman legions withdrew from Britain around 407, they left behind Christian communities that were essentially cut off from the wider Roman Church. For nearly 2 centuries, these communities evolved on their own, developing their own liturgical customs, their own way of calculating Easter using the computus, and their own distinctive monastic culture. Meanwhile, Irish monks, inspired by figures like Saint Columba, who founded the great monastery on Iona in 563, and later Saint Aidan of Lindisfarne, who brought this tradition deep into Northumbria, built an extraordinary network of monasteries, stretching from Ireland across Scotland and into northern England. Then, in 597, Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine of Canterbury to convert the Anglo-Saxons, followed decades later by Paulinus of York, who established Roman Christianity in Northumbria itself. Suddenly, there were 2 streams of Christianity flowing through the same island, and they didn't always agree. The differences between these 2 traditions weren't about core theology. They believed the same creed, worshipped the same God, read the same scriptures. What divided them were questions of practice, including how monks shaved their heads, how they organized their monasteries, and most visibly, how they calculated the date of Easter through the computus. The Celtic tradition used an older 84-year cycle for computing Easter, while Rome had adopted a newer 19-year cycle from the Church of Alexandria. The 2 methods could produce Easter dates up to 4 weeks apart, and this wasn't just an abstract problem. Picture King Oswiu of Northumbria celebrating Easter Sunday, breaking his Lenten fast, feasting with his court, while his wife Queen Iona, who was from Kent and followed Roman customs, was still fasting, still deep in the austerity of Lent, observing what she considered Palm Sunday. Same palace, same day, 2 different Easters. That's not just theologically awkward, that's a political crisis waiting to happen. A few years before the Synod in 664, the tension had become impossible to ignore. Oswiu's son Alfrith, the sub-king of Deira, had thrown in his lot with the Roman party. The historian Henry Mayer Harding described Alfrith as the chief cause of the trouble that led to the synod. He expelled Irish monks from the monastery at Ripon, and he handed it to a young, ambitious Northumbrian churchman named Wilfrid, who had recently returned from Rome, dazzled by what he had seen there. So Oswiu convened a synod at the double monastery of Strionshall, what we now call Whitby, perched on the headland above the North Sea. The monastery was led by Abbess Hilda, one of the most formidable women of her age. She had been granted 1,200 acres by Oswiu to found the place in 657, and she had built it into a powerhouse of learning so respected that kings came to her for advice. The cast of characters assembled at Whitby reads like a who's who of 7th century English Christianity. Arguing for the Celtic side was Bishop Colman of Lindisfarne, an Irishman educated on Iona, supported by Abbess Hilda and Bishop Cedd, who crucially served as translator between the 2 parties. Here was a man who uniquely understood both traditions, having served under both the Roman Paulinus and the Irish Aidan. On the Roman side stood Wilfrid, eloquent and politically savvy, alongside Bishop Agilbert, a Frankish bishop representing continental European Christianity, whose inability to argue fluently in Old English meant Wilfrid got to make the case instead. Even James the deacon was there, a man who had served under the original Roman missionary Paulinus decades earlier and had never once wavered from Roman practice. As the historian Benedicta Ward has observed, this was fundamentally a meeting of friends, of Christians who loved one another and wanted to solve a problem. Except possibly for Oswiu, for whom this was also very much a matter of secular politics. Colman argued from tradition. He cited the authority of Saint Columba and the beloved Saint Aidan, whose death just 7 years earlier had left this very question unresolved, and the practices handed down from the Apostle John. The Irish way was ancient, proven, and holy. But Wilfrid was devastating in his response. He did not just argue for Roman practice. He went straight for the theological jugular. When Oswiu asked who held the keys to the kingdom of heaven, Wilfrid quoted Christ's own words from the Gospel of Matthew. "You are Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and to you I give the keys to the kingdom of heaven." Then came Oswiu's famous declaration. He turned to Colman and asked whether Christ had truly said this to Peter. Colman had no choice but to agree, and Oswiu delivered his verdict with what might have been a smile. "Then I tell you, since he is the doorkeeper, I will not contradict him. I intend to obey his commands in everything to the best of my knowledge and ability. Otherwise, when I come to the gates of the kingdom of heaven, there may be no one to open them, because the one who on your own showing holds the keys has turned his back on me." It's a brilliant piece of rhetoric, and possibly a brilliant piece of political theater. Oswiu, a man educated by Irish monks, who spoke Irish fluently and deeply respected the tradition of Aidan, chose Rome. Some scholars have called Wilfrid's advocacy a triumphant push against an open door, since most of the Irish had already accepted the Roman Easter, and Iona was increasingly isolated. But the political implications were real. By siding with Rome, Oswiu diffused the factional crisis his son had created, and won vital papal acknowledgement of his supremacy in England. The aftermath was swift and dramatic. Colman resigned as Bishop of Lindisfarne, gathered up all the Irish monks and 30 English monks, took some of the bones of Saint Aidan himself, and sailed back to Iona. Eventually, he founded a monastery on the island of Inishbofin off the west coast of Ireland. But even there, the old divisions followed him. The English monks complained that every summer, the Irish went off preaching, while the Anglo-Saxons were left to plant and harvest the fields alone. Colman had to found a separate monastery for the English monks, which grew into the famous Mayo of the Saxons, eventually covering over 2,000 acres with more than 100 monks. Back in England, the Roman party consolidated its victory. Theodore of Tarsus arrived as Archbishop of Canterbury in 669, and Bede called him the first archbishop obeyed by all the English Church. He summoned the Synod of Hartford in 672, the first council of the entire English Church, beginning the process of creating a unified ecclesiastical structure that would endure through Oswiu's successor Ecgfrith and for centuries beyond. But the Celtic tradition did not vanish overnight. The Picts did not accept the Roman Easter until 710. Iona held out until 716. The Welsh churches resisted until 768, over a century after Whitby. There is a temptation, and it has been around since the Protestant Reformation, to frame Whitby as the moment a free, independent Celtic church was crushed by authoritarian Rome. But that is not really what happened. There was no unified Celtic church. There were scattered local customs, regional practices, communities united more by what they were not than by what they were. Once Rome prevailed, those various forms could not survive without institutional support. What Whitby really was a decision about which direction England would face. Was it west toward the decentralized, monastic, deeply local Christianity of the Irish tradition? Or south toward Rome, toward continental Europe, toward a centralized, standardized, and ultimately more powerful institutional church. Oswiu chose south, whether he did it for theology, for politics, or because he genuinely feared being locked out of heaven by St. Peter. That choice shaped the religious and political landscape of Britain for the next 1,000 years. Oswiu's choice at Whitby came down to one question: whose authority do you trust? Centuries earlier, one man asked an even more dangerous version of that question, and in trying to define what Christians should and should not believe, he accidentally helped create the Bible itself. That is the story coming up next.